Good evening. I want to welcome everyone to our Wednesday night Bible study. First, there's a bit of housekeeping. This phone was found in a bathroom. There's a nice little cat with a hat and a pair of sunglasses on it. This is your phone. Grab it after service or after I get done. It's got to belong to somebody here, I would guess. Tonight, I'm finally going to get to the thing I promised for 2 weeks, and we're going to talk about, is it wrong to be wealthy? But before we get into that, let's have a word of prayer together. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for this opportunity we have to gather tonight to study your word. Help us as we learn from your word that we might learn about how we should handle our finances in accordance with what you teach. Be with all those that teach tonight, Heavenly Father, that they might teach effectively and that those that listen to them may learn much from it. We thank you for all that you give us and all you bless us with. In Christ's name, amen. All right. Oh, come on now, don't be difficult. This worked fine, I promise. There we go. All right. Is it wrong to be wealthy? Now, I asked a question. Is it the same thing to be wealthy and to make a lot of money? I say the answer is no. Wealth is how much you have. That is, how many assets you have minus how many debts you owe. You can make a lot of money and blow through every penny of it, whether you make $20,000 a year or $1 million a year. I've known people that make a lot of money and they don't have a dime to show for it. They just go through it as fast as they can. You ever seen some of these athletes that make millions and millions of dollars, and then when their contract's up, a year later, they're bankrupt? They haven't built any wealth. And that's all wealth is your assets minus your debts. Sometimes you hear that called net worth. But in the Bible, we read, of course, of the rich young ruler. And that's in Matthew chapter 19, starting with verse 23. We're going to read what Jesus said after the young men left him. And he said, Then Jesus said to his disciples, Assuredly I say to you that it is hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And again I say to you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. Now we see that phrase, camel to go through the eye of a needle. I've heard there's an actual gate where a camel could fold up and go through it, or it's just a metaphor. I my opinion, lean toward the metaphor, like we have a metaphor about a needle, finding a needle in a haystack. But either way, it's difficult is what that means. And an interesting I'll just throw this out here, it's for free. When I was studying that, in Luke, he actually uses a different Greek word for that needle. And it turns out it can represent a surgeon's needle, which that would be applicable to Luke, wouldn't it? Because he was a physician. So you can see where even though it was God-breathed, his personality was in there when he wrote that because he wrote it from a perspective he was familiar with. All right, so now let's go. I'm going to read this one a lot tonight, so just be prepared. Luke chapter 12, verse 16. This is a very familiar parable to us as well. Then he spoke a parable to them, saying, The ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, What shall I do, since I have no room to store my crops? So he said, I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build greater. And there I will store all my crops and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, Fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will those things be which you have provided? So is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. So you see, he had a surplus of crops. And instead of thinking, well, maybe I could help somebody, I could distribute these to the needy, he tears down, and notice it's barns. It's not even a barn, it's multiple barns to build bigger ones to hold his plenty. But what you see in these two incidents is the issues with their attitude. The rich young ruler was ruled by his riches, and the wealthy farmer didn't use his extra to help others, even though it was going to be painful for him to keep it. Because remember, he had to tear down those barns and build bigger ones because he didn't have room to hold all he had grown that year. And verse 21 tells us the problem. He was laying up treasure for himself and not treasures in heaven. So you see my first phrase up there, wealthy is relative. Now, this is one of those little things that interests me, and it may not interest you at all. But the Forbes magazine every year puts out a list of the 400 richest Americans. Let me see if I can get this to come up. All right, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Those are the 5 richest Americans. You might recognize the guy in the middle on the top. Does anybody know who that is? That's Bill Gates. You recognize any of those other 4 guys? Bezos is the first one. Who's the guy that young guy on the end? Anybody know? Zuckerberg. That's Warren Buffett. Now, if anybody can get the 5th one, I'll be impressed. No, I'll tell you in a minute. No, it's actually who? Ellison. Good. I'm very impressed. Ellison is the 5th one. All right. Bezos, of course, founded that company called Amazon. I remember it when I was, I guess I was in my 30s, yeah. I loved to go to bookstores. But then suddenly this company came out and you could buy books online and they'd be delivered to your house. So the first book I bought was called How to Coach T-Ball. So you can guess how long ago that was. When Jonathan was playing T-ball. That's the early 90s, early to mid 90s was the first book I bought. Now, Mr. Bezos is way ahead of Mr. Gates. But he'd be further ahead if something hadn't happened to him in 2019 and he lost 1/4 of his net worth. Does anybody know what happened? He got a divorce. His wife got half his assets, and Miss Mackenzie Scott, I think she just got married, is the 13th richest person in America because of that. And we may talk about that a little later in our study about divorce and wealth. Bill Gates, of course, is Microsoft. Started that company with Mr. Allen. Mark Zuckerberg started Facebook as a way to look at pictures of people at Harvard when he was attending there. Warren Buffett, the Oracle of Omaha, they call him, he's 90. He's probably the oldest guy there is in the list, I think. He made his money investing, but he started out hustling for, delivering newspapers, working in a store, all sorts of things to earn his money. Larry Ellison is a technology guy, a company called Oracle. I won't go into a bunch of techno-nerdy kind of stuff about relational databases and stuff, but my company used his product. Basically, a database is just a way you can pull data from somebody very easily or information about things. The interesting little tidbit about him is he owns almost entirely the Hawaiian island of Lanai. Why he wanted it, I don't know. Now, Mr. Buffett's company, I left this out. I didn't realize this until I studied all the companies he owns. Geico, Duracell, Dairy Queen are 3 I'm sure you've heard of. Are earned by his company, Berkshire Hathaway, that he has. But anyway, these are the 5 richest Americans in billions and billions of dollars. Now let me throw out another question. What last name do you think is the most common in the 400 richest? And I missed this. I thought I had it till I counted it. Who would you think it is? Walton, but Walton's second. Walton has 7. A couple siblings, his kids, and even a grandson, I think. There's one name that is in there more, and I was surprised until I saw it and counted it. Anybody have any idea? There's 8 of them. No, actually not. It's somebody the Illinois ones of us here might know a little better than the Kentucky ones. Pritzker. There are 8 Pritzkers in the list, including Mr. Pritzker there, the governor. They made their money. There's some company, I want to say it's called Marmon, that sold all these contractor supplies to different contractors, plus hot hotels they own. They actually sold their company to Berkshire Hathaway. And that's where I think a lot of them got their money. But he's not the richest politician on the list. Any guesses? And it's not Donald Trump. He's on the list, but he's below Mr. Pritzker. Not Romney. Not Bush. Bloomberg. That guy. Former mayor of New York. Financial information. He's 14th. He's right behind Jeff Bezos' ex-wife. Now, one more thing. Got to do sports. Who's the richest sports figure? It's not a player. It's an owner. His franchise is supposed to be worth the most of any sports franchise, the most valuable sports franchise. Who do you think it'd be? Jerry Jones, yes. I didn't realize that he played football at the University of Arkansas. I guess that's where he got interested in it. He made his money, as you might guess, in Texas in the oil. He bought the Cowboys for $150 million, and they're now worth $5.5 billion. So he made a pretty good investment, didn't he? All right, and like Ed Steger used to tell me, I'll throw all that in for free. But the point is, wealthy's relative, isn't it? There's nobody in here that you would consider wealthy compared to any of those guys, is it? But if we compare ourselves to people like, say, in certain parts of Asia and Africa, everybody in this room is wealthy compared to them. I think of when Brother Ray Hart gives his reports on the work in India, and you see some of the conditions the people live in there. There's an organization I'm sure you've heard of called Healing Hands. One of the big things they do in a country that makes the people thrilled is they build a community well. You know, we're all spoiled. You know, we go in our house, you turn the tap, and there's water. They're thrilled to have a community well they can go and get water at. When I taught middle school classes, I used to talk about a work in India by a man named Dean Crutchfield that we used to support, and he's no longer with us. But he also did, missionary work in India. And there was a preaching school, and they taught young men to be preachers. And they would go around on Sunday to multiple different congregations. And there was something they were thrilled to have that most young kids would take for granted. You know what it was? A bicycle. That's right. They were thrilled to have a bicycle because it meant they didn't have to walk from city to city. And that's something that most young people, you just get a bike when you're a kid, right? But they thought it was a big deal. So again, the point I'm making is it's relative to be wealthy is the first thing. All right. There are wealthy people discussed in Scripture, and we're going to talk about a few of them. And they're all going to be people you're very familiar with. And the first one is Abraham. Genesis 12:16. And this is when the first time, or one of the times, that his wife was taken into somebody else's house when he said she was his sister. But when she finally left, it said Pharaoh in verse 16 there, he treated Abram well for her sake. He had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys, and camels. Had a lot of possessions that he got. And if you go to the next chapter, chapter 13, verse 6, this is Lot, and I'll read verse 5. Lot also, who went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents. Now the land was not able to support them, that they might dwell together, for their possessions were so great they could not dwell together. They had so much, land wouldn't support them, both being in the same place. And you know the story, he let Lot have first choice, and Lot saw how well watered the plain was towards Sodom. And that's where he went, and turned out that didn't work out so well for him. All right, another guy is Job. So let's go to the book of Job. He actually became rich twice. You go to Job chapter 1, verse 3. Also, his possessions were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and a very large household, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. If you go down to verse 8, when God's talking to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil. So even with all those possessions, God called him a blameless and upright man who fears God and shuns evil. So then we get to David. Now David, you remember, wanted to build the temple for God, but God wouldn't let him. How come? Blood on his head. Bloody warring man. He wanted to let someone that was peaceable, which would be his son Solomon, and I believe Solomon means peace, build it. But David, doing like a lot of us dads want to do, to try to help our kids out, whether they want it or not sometimes, right, Jonathan? But they want to help their kids. They want to make plans for them. If you go to 1 Chronicles 28, verse 14, he laid up a lot of material for Solomon to build the temple. It says he gave gold by weight for things of gold, for all articles used in every kind of service, also silver for all articles of silver by weight, for all articles used in every kind of service. And if you keep reading, he gave him all this gold to make all these things out of pure gold and pure silver. So David obviously had some wealth too. If you read the whole chapter, you can see David gave him plans for how the temple ought to be built and how the Levites ought to do their work. So he tried to help his son out as much as possible. Of course, we go to King Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 7, after the Queen of Sheba had come to visit him. And she said, "However, I did not believe the words until I came and saw with my own eyes, and indeed the half was not told to me. Your wisdom and prosperity exceed the fame of which I heard." So she had, she thought he was well off, but not even the half of it was known to her until she came to see him. Now, it wasn't his wealth that turned his heart away from God. What was it? His very next chapter, loving these different women that were not godly women. In 1 Kings 11, verse 1, "But King Solomon loved many foreign women, as well as the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites, from the nations of whom the Lord had said to the children of Israel, 'You shall not intermarry with them, nor they with you. Surely they will turn away your heart after their gods.' Solomon clung to these in love, and he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart." The wisest man that was ever on this earth except for Jesus, but he let those women turn his heart away from God. Now, I can't imagine 700 wives. It's all I can do to be a good husband to one wife, as somebody might be able to tell you. It takes a lot of effort to be a good husband to one wife. I can't even fathom what he was thinking. But anyway, all right, in the New Testament, we even have Joseph of Arimathea. Turn to Matthew chapter 27, verse 57. "Now when evening had come, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who himself had also become a disciple of Jesus." Now notice that. Rich man, but also a disciple of Jesus. And he goes to Pilate, asks for the body, buries it in his tomb. So you can see there are a lot of righteous people in the Bible who are wealthy. All right, don't be difficult again. There we go. All right. The thing we have to remember is we want to acquire money honestly. That's the real challenge I think we're talking about here, and correctly and use it wisely. Now let's look at 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 17, a little further down than we sometimes read. "Command those who are rich in this present age not to be haughty, nor to trust in uncertain riches, but in the living God, who gives us richly all things to enjoy." I'm going to maybe go down one more here. I apologize that I'm having trouble. I used to make fun of poor Jim about this, and now I'm doing it myself. Okay. But anyway, haughty. What does it mean to be haughty? Yeah, or even think you're better than somebody else, right? Be full of yourself. Think you're the one that accomplishes it and you're better than anybody else. Well, what Paul is saying here is when you're rich, don't think you're better than other people. Don't trust in the uncertainty of riches, but trust in God. Now, what that tells me is you can be rich and not be haughty and be pleasing to God if you have the right attitude and not trust in those uncertain riches. And then let's look at one more. Let's look at 3 John and verse 2. And it says, Beloved, I pray that you may prosper in all things and be in health just as your soul prospers. So John even asked this blessing that they prosper in everything. And I got to believe that includes money too. So the bottom line is, more money we make, the more we can help, right? But as long as we do it, it's got that caveat, we do it honestly and not at the expense of our health, our family, our honesty, our integrity, and especially our service to God. We can't let money become our idol. You remember we talked about money's a great servant but a terrible master. And if you think about the end of Luke 12:28, I believe, where it says, much is given, much is required. So if you have more money, then more is required of you because of that. So that's important to keep in mind. So now, let's talk about, and it's going to seem odd segue here, the perils of money. What's a peril? It's something that's dangerous, that can cause you a lot of trouble. I always think of that old silent movie, The Perils of Pauline. Has anybody ever heard of that? I know none of you is probably ever old enough to have seen them, but you know, this girl was always getting in trouble, and some dashing hero had to save her from, like, the one I always think of, she'd be tied to the railroad track, the big train's coming down there, getting ready to run her over, and you'd have to snatch her up at the last minute. Well, that's the way you think of a peril. So we're going to go back to that rich farmer parable and talk about that again. And I warned you we're going to do this, but we're going to go back to Luke chapter 12 and talk about that just a little bit more in reference to that. Luke chapter 12. Starting with verse 13 this time. All right. First, we'll do the introduction. Then one from the crowd said to him, Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. But he said to him, Man, who made me a judge or an arbitrator over you? And he said to them, Take heed and beware of covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses. So a man comes to Jesus and he says, Will you talk to my brother and tell him to divide his inheritance with him? Now, I don't know if the brother was the executor and he was holding back part of it, or it was because of the custom back then that the oldest got a double portion, and maybe that younger brother thought he should have gotten a little more of that money. But the bottom line is he goes to Jesus to ask him to, what should I do? And Jesus tells him in the next verse pretty much, that's not my responsibility. That's not my job while I'm here. I'm not supposed to be a judge or an arbitrator. But as Jesus was really good at doing as the master teacher, he's going to take this and use it to teach a lesson. He's saying that we are not to covet because our life doesn't consist of what we have. That doesn't make up our lives. And all covetousness is to me is when you want something so bad you do anything to get it, or you put it ahead of God. It becomes your idol. That's covetousness. So let's go to the next section of the parable, starting with verse 16. Then he spoke a parable to them, saying, The ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, What shall I do, since I have no room to store my crops? So he said, I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there I will store all my crops and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. All right. Again, we talked about it. His ground yielded so plentifully, he didn't have room to store everything. So far, he's okay. But then he makes that poor decision. He doesn't say, Oh, Well, I know there's a lot of needy people. Why don't I give them some of this? He's going to tear down those barns, plural, to build bigger barns. And he thinks he's got it made now. He thinks, well, man, I got all this. I just lay back. I eat, drink, be merry. My life I am set. But he's about to find out he's not. All right, verse 20. But God said to him, fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will those things be which you have provided? So is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. So God calls him a fool. He tells him he's going to die that very night. Then who's going to get all this stuff? Not him. Maybe some of his relatives, maybe the Roman government will get it. But he's not going to have it. It's gone. And then he says, those who lay up treasure for themselves and not for God are foolish. Now notice how many times you see these, and I hope my English is right, these personal pronouns and adjectives in there. He thought within himself, what shall I do? My crops, my barns, my crops. Again, I said that twice. My goods, my soul, take your ease. This shows where his thoughts were. He was only thinking about himself. He didn't think about anybody else. And he didn't think, who made him steward over all these things? Who allowed him to have all this stuff? He didn't think about any of that. And that's his problem there. And again, let's go to Matthew 19:24. All right. There we go. Okay. And again, we've read through this. And I say again to you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God, because oftentimes when you get wealthy, really wealthy, you sometimes forget you should help others. And who made you the steward over all that? God. All right. And then let's go to 1 Timothy chapter 6. Verses 9 and 10. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and harmful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, for which some have strayed from the faith in their greediness and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. We think about that first part of verse 10, but there's a lot more to what's said there. There's dangers. Compromise the truth, lose your integrity. You might cheat to your own benefit. They can fall into many foolish and harmful lusts. You think about the goals in certain lifestyles that can turn you away from God. I thought of entertainment. It's not always the case, but a lot of times you're an entertainer, you might have to entertain people in places that a Christian ought not to go. You might have to miss worship to perform. You may be pushed to dress in an immodest way. So wanting to be rich can often lead you to doing things that you shouldn't do. And the love of money, greed, is that unquenchable desire for more and more money. You're never satisfied. You never got enough. The accumulation of things cannot bring happiness and satisfaction. And this is in Ecclesiastes chapter 5. And this, of course, is from Solomon, who would know. He who loves silver will not be satisfied with silver, nor he who loves abundance with increase. If you're greedy, you're never going to have enough. I got all the silver I want, now I want gold. I got all the gold I want platinum. Got all the platinum I want diamonds. Got all the diamonds I want uranium, something. You just want to keep getting more and more and more. But in the future, you're going to look back with regret and sorrow, just like Solomon did, as we see in that book. All right, and we talked about this already, about being haughty. But we'll talk about it again because it does apply here. All right. We read that in 1 Timothy, but let's look at Proverbs 16:19. And this is a familiar verse. Pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. So when you have that pride and arrogance, eventually you're going to fall. All right. And Adam talked about the value of our soul in a lesson a couple of weeks ago. Matthew 16, verse 26, about how valuable, it's the most valuable thing you've got. And you don't want to do anything to endanger that. For what profit is it to a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? It doesn't matter if you end up being richer than Jeff Bezos was, and you have everything your heart could desire. If it costs you your soul, it's not worth it. 100 years being the wealthiest guy on earth isn't going to equal an eternity being lost in hell, is it? No. Let's also look at Matthew chapter 13, verse 22, I believe is what I want. Yeah, this is the parable of the sower, and Jesus is explaining it, and he says, now he who receives seed among the thorns is he who hears the word, and the cares of this world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word. Notice that deceitfulness of riches chokes the word, and he becomes unfruitful. You're so caught up in your riches, you can't be bothered to worry about anybody else. You worry about yourself. Now, even literature takes this selling the soul thing. I don't know if you Christopher Marlowe. He was a contemporary of Shakespeare in the play Dr. Faustus. It's where a guy sells his soul to the devil. And it's also, I didn't realize this. You ever seen those cartoons where like a guy will be trying to decide something over on one shoulder it's this angel and on the other side it's the devil? Well, it comes from that play. I didn't know that. But that's where that comes from. And then you have Washington Irving wrote Devil and Tom Walker, and Stephen Benet wrote The Devil and Daniel Webster. Now there's also a song, of course, about the devil went down to Georgia too. But that's a common theme in literature, is a man selling his soul to the devil and how bad it ends up being for him. So even in the world of literature, you can see that this is not good. The value of a soul compared to anything else you can have. All right, let's just make some observations about money. All right, there we go. All right, money can't solve all your problems. We just read about that. It cannot fix anything. Some people think it can, but it can't. Money can't buy happiness. You hear that all the time, but that's true. That rich farmer, he thought, man, I got all these crops, got this bumper crop, I'm good for life. And what happened? He died. Lost his soul. It can change your outlook. You get haughty, you get full of yourself. You think, I did this. This is me. It's all about me. It's why this worked out. And you forget, no, it's because of God that you have all this stuff. Not because of what you did, but God did it. All right. Money can complicate raising kids. Sometimes to make a lot of money, you got to work a lot of extra hours, don't you? Or sometimes, you ever known kids that come from wealthy families and they might think, they're entitled to everything? Or when they get older, they don't realize, maybe my mom and dad had to work really hard for that stuff. That's why they got it. Not because I earn, just automatically earn it. And finally, unfortunately for us, money does not come with instructions. It requires experience, advice, study to manage it correctly. We can get that from others, and hopefully this study is going to help us do a little bit better at managing money. And the more you have, the more it takes to manage it. And it can breed indifference. You take for granted. Do we appreciate what we have? I talked about that water example a minute ago. Those people being thrilled to have a community well, and how we can just, in this church building, there's water and bathrooms. And I'm old enough to remember, this is how old I am. It's one of them old man stories Jonathan talks about. When I was a little boy, our congregation did not have indoor plumbing. Imagine having to go to the bathroom when it's cold outside to an outdoor facility, and I'll leave it at that. We have a building we can regulate the temperature in. We didn't have, if I remember correctly, air conditioning then. And you see, like when Brother Ray shows those people in India worshiping, and they're in a building with maybe a dangling light bulb up there, but the room's packed. They're out in the street. There's so many of them. I can remember my granny talking about walking to worship. It's bad enough the building wasn't going to be cooled or heated. It's bad enough they didn't have indoor plumbing, but then you had to walk to church. We're really blessed, and sometimes I think we get a little indifferent about how well off we are with things. I do. I'll tell you that right off. All right. How do we know we love money? There are some ways I believe we can tell. And the first one is pretty obvious. I want to acquire it in the wrong way. We talked about wrong ways to acquire money, right? Stealing it, being dishonest, through greed, gambling, I love money when I idolize wealth. Colossians 3, verse 5. Therefore, put to death your members which are on earth: fornication, uncleanness, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. Talked about a minute ago. You covet something like money bad enough, that's your idol. That's what you worship. You think of idolatry and you think of something like metal or stone figure sitting here. That's not really applicable to us today, but we can be idol worshipers if we worship money, where it's the most important thing in the world to us. That's our idol. We talked about this one, but again, it makes me feel haughty. I think I'm better than somebody else because I have money. I don't remember why I have money. Who's blessed me with that? Who made me the steward of that? And this last one I will tell you is a big one to me. I become insensitive to those around me. First John 3:17. All right. But whoever has this world's goods and sees his brother in need and shuts up his heart from him, how does the love of God abide in him? When we start ignoring that people around us are need things, that shows we have the love of money. And what I think of is something you might not necessarily, but I always think of it when I taught the book of Ruth a couple of years ago. That's one of my favorite books of the Bible, because I think that is the most interesting account. And it would make a great, if you had a guy wrote a book kind of like it, I think it'd be really good. But, of course, God wrote a much better one. Turn to Ruth chapter 1, verse 1 with me. Let's reacquaint ourselves with that. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. So there was a famine. So they left Israel, this man and his wife and his 2 sons, they went to Moab. Well, while they were there, the 2 sons got married. One of them married Orpah and one of them married Ruth. And while they were there, you remember what happened? All the men died. And all that was left was Naomi and Ruth and Orpah. And Naomi said, y'all just stay here because I don't have any sons for you to marry. And Orpah stayed, but Ruth, you remember that, famous scriptures, wherever you go, I will go, and your God will be my God. And I'm paraphrasing there. But you remember when they got back, what did Ruth have to do so they would have food to eat? She gleaned. Now, by the law of Moses, back then, you had to make your fields available for gleaning, and you weren't supposed to go over your fields more than once. You harvested one time. If you left a sheaf of grain behind, you weren't supposed to go get it. You weren't supposed to go over your olive trees more than once. You weren't supposed to go over your grapevines more than once. And you remember Ruth went there, and that's how she was able to support her and Naomi, was by the gleaning of those, that field. Now, remember, she ended up on Boaz's land. Now, what if Boaz had said, I know what the law of Moses said, but we just had a famine. And I probably ought to go back over my fields multiple times to get all the grain I can get and store it up just in case there's a famine. Now, that all sounds good, but he'd have been disobeying God's law. And he didn't do that, did he? You remember what he did for Ruth? Not only let her glean, do you remember what he told the guys to do for her? Leave some extra. He said, drop some grain on the ground. Drop some extra heads of the grain so that Ruth can have them. So he even went further beyond that. And you think about how blessed he was. He got him a wife, a son, a great-grandson named David, and he's in the lineage of Christ. But he could have been greedy and not thought of others and been insensitive to other people. But you know what? He wasn't. And I think that's a good example for us to end that discussion. So I don't think I'll start this lesson, but I'll give you a hint. We're going to start getting into some, and I hate to use the word secular, but some practical applications of money. And that's what we're going to start with next time, is the wise use of money versus debt. And if you want to read up, I'm going to read the parable of the prodigal son in Luke 15, but I'm going to talk about it in a way you may never have heard. We're going to talk about all the financial mistakes that young man made and how we can apply them to our life to start. So for next time, read the parable of the prodigal son and see what maybe financial lessons you can get from that. And I also want you to think about something that you might hear a lot, and we're going to talk about it. You ever heard of good debt versus bad debt? I want you to think about that phrase. Is there such a thing as good debt? And we got a few minutes, but I don't want to get into this, so let's just stop here. Again, I'm going to leave this phone up here on the table, and whoever it is can come up and grab it after I get done talking. I appreciate your attention to my lesson tonight.